Okay, folks, so we're not going to be going live to Facebook because Facebook decided that we've had enough with you today. So we're going live to YouTube instead, just so you're aware.
Wonderful.
Yes, so we are now live and you are being recorded. So don't say anything that you want held against you or you don't want held against you.
On that note, I'm going to thank everyone for attending the ElderWorks Virtual Senior Fair. As we head into our second and final day and second to last presenter, I wanted to introduce myself. First, Barbara Rosenberg, one of the senior care consultants with ElderWorks. We are a complimentary service for seniors, for their families, for resources, for placement in retirement living, assisted living, memory care, skilled care, and home care. We have wonderful partnerships with most of the companies in the state. We also produce a fabulous senior directory, which is online and by paper, coming out again for 2021 next year. We are delighted this evening to welcome Pat Kenneally, speaking on laws and COVID-19. Pat was elected McHenry County State's Attorney in 2016 after having served as an Assistant State's Attorney for 10 years. During his tenure, he has worked in every area of the office, prosecuting thousands of criminal cases and representing the county in legal matters. Patrick believes it is his duty to seek justice by protecting victims' rights without ever losing sight of his ethical responsibility to ensure the rights of defendants. He has been awarded the Turning Point Peace and Justice Award for his work on behalf of victims of domestic battery and currently serves on the executive board of the McHenry County Substance Abuse Coalition. Patrick earned his law degree from Washington University of Law in 2005 and also has a master's degree in environmental law from the University of Vermont prior to law school. Patrick earned his bachelor's degree in biology and liberal arts from the College of Holy Cross. So without further ado, Patrick Kenneally.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to Jennifer Prell for helping me get this all set up and walking me through the wonders of modern technology. So I am a little red because I'm down on vacation. We had scheduled this a few months in advance, and so you're all now part of the Kenneally 2020 family vacation. And if anybody is interested in coming down here and helping me with childcare with 4 kids, you're more than welcome to come. So that being all said, we're here to talk about COVID and the law. And there's a ton of material to get into because so much has been happening so quickly, and it's really, this presentation almost needs to be updated on a day-to-day basis. But I just want to jump right in just because we only have about 45 minutes if we're going to make time for questions. And like I said, there's just a ton of material because a lot has been happening from a legal standpoint as it relates to COVID over the last few months. So our story begins in Wuhan, China in November, December of 2020. COVID-19 is an acronym for coronavirus disease 19, 19 being the year that it was discovered, not just the 19th coronavirus that's known. And the COVID-19 virus, it comes from a very large family of coronaviruses that infect a number of species on Earth. And corona is Latin for crown. And it gets its name because if you're looking at the slide here, the picture to your right, I guess the scientists seem to think that those red sort of protrudences from the coronavirus look like a crown. I think they look a little bit more like hair plugs, but that's just me. And it's believed that COVID-19 originated in bats. And the reason that they think that is because of the genetic similarity to other coronaviruses that are naturally found in bats. And bats are sold regularly at these wet markets in China, which are just sort of these markets where they sell these live bats for people to take home and slaughter and then kill. But interestingly also is that Wuhan, China is the home of the largest infectious disease lab in China. And there's been a lot of people who have claimed that the virus may have come out of the Chinese lab, but as of right now, there's just not a lot of evidentiary support to back up this claim. So a coronavirus is about 100 times smaller than the human cell, and it works like all viruses. It binds to a receptor in the cell, it gets inside the cell, and then it forces the cell to, it kind of hijacks the DNA making machinery of a cell, and it forces the cell to make more viruses of itself, which ultimately cause the cell kind of to explode. And when enough cells in your body begin to be taken over by the virus, that's how you feel sick. And it generally affects cells in the upper respiratory tract. And of course, the danger comes, as we're all well aware, when it spreads into the lungs. So for those people who think that, oh, well, coronavirus is just sort of a hoax, or it's no more dangerous than the flu, or it really hasn't resulted in an increased rate of mortality among the population, not only in the United States or the world, but also in Illinois, this chart gives you this chart would stand in contradiction to that. So if you're looking at this chart, that orange line is based on statistical averages, how many people we would expect to die over the time frame that it relates to. So if you follow that orange line all the way to the end of the chart, we come to April of 2020, going all the way to basically where we are right now. And that orange line, again, that's how many people we would have expected to die in that time frame. And if you look, we exceed deaths by hundreds of people every single week. And this is generally linked to deaths that are caused by the coronavirus. So it's not just necessarily people that would otherwise have died. This is actually instigating far more deaths than we otherwise would expect, which makes this a real public health threat. And as a result of the fact that it's a real public health threat, this needs to be responded to by our government. Okay, and we're going to talk about how we have done that, and from a legal standpoint, what some of the ramifications have been. So to me, the whole sort of coronavirus hysteria, or really our attempts as a government, both in the United States, but also in the state of Illinois, to deal with this began on March 12th of 2020. And this is when a lot of the hysteria, at least in my mind, started. And that's the night that President Trump gave his national address. And I remember having heard of coronavirus. I knew that it was something that was out there, whether or not it could be contained or not, how much it was going to spread and be disseminated, and the impact that it was going to have really was up in the air. Nobody really had a good idea of how this was going to affect everybody. And I don't think anybody could have anticipated just the magnitude and the scope of the effects that it's had on all of us, not only in Illinois, not only in the United States, but also in the world. So when the president said, well, we're going to be giving this talk on March 12th, I remember eagerly tuning in to hear the president's speech. And in fairness, it probably wasn't his best performance. Trump, who had been largely kind of downplaying the risk of the virus, now he gets on camera with the markets in free fall to sort of acknowledge that this was a major problem. The government was going to be taking drastic action, which included banning all travel from China. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, whoa, that seems this is big. And for me, and I think my wife and a lot of people around me, it was really the first time that I was forced to acknowledge and kind of grapple with the enormity and the scope of the threat that was faced. And as the president continued to give his somewhat uneven speech, where even he appeared sort of to be a little bit nervous, and I've never seen that out of President Trump. He's not really the kind of guy to show his emotions much. I've never seen him smile. I've certainly never seen him look scared, but as he was twiddling his thumbs and giving, again, probably not his best speech, and I'm not exactly a rabid anti-Trump person. And then on top of that, as he was speaking, and he was sort of making everybody uneasy by the fact that he kind of seemed uneasy, across the screen now, Tom Hanks and his lovely wife have also been exposed to the coronavirus. They've come down with it. And I just remember thinking, like, oh my God, if America's sweetheart here is getting coronavirus and his life seems to be in peril, what hope is what hope is there for the rest of us? So Trump, after March 12th, starts holding his press conferences, and he's doing it on a daily basis. And a bunch of other governors start to get in on the act. In fact, probably all 50 governors, after around mid-March, begin to hold these daily press conferences where they're talking about what's going on with COVID-19, what they're doing, and how they're going to try to mitigate many of the harms that they, quote unquote, anticipate. And if you listen to Governor Pritzker, and I don't know if any of you did, but I tried to watch as many of the press conferences as I could because it related to me and my job. His most common refrain when kind of asked about what he's doing and why he's doing it is that he's essentially trying to follow the science. And He's doing what the science and the modeling is telling him to do. So apparently each day he goes to the science oracle, which apparently then divines the proper public policy and then imparts that upon the governor. But I think what we all need to be aware of is that, especially from a government standpoint, is that science answers empirical questions. It answers questions like what and how much and how long. It answers things like, does this cause this effect? Science does not and was never designed to answer moral and political questions, such as what should we or what ought we do with the information that we have. So we have this information on modeling. How do we then take that information in terms of our willingness to accept certain risks, in terms of wanting to protect society, but also perhaps wanting to protect other interests and balancing that against the danger that this poses? Science cannot answer those questions. Rather, politicians need to answer those questions. Moral considerations need to be brought in. And so when Governor Pritzker kept saying the science is telling us to do this, I was always a little bit skeptical of that, as I think everybody should be. And in addition to that, we've seen sort of dozens of scientific models, many of which are drastically different with enormous ranges of statistical error in terms of the hospital beds needed, in terms of the number of cases that we should have expected. And there was a ton of uncertainty when we're looking at some of the worst projections. And it appears that Illinois, at least at the beginning, sort of went all in on the side of caution and on the side of acting in a aggressive and strident manner to try to limit the spread of COVID-19. And as an example of this, I don't know if many of you recall, but we initially planned on building 3,000 beds at McCormick Place. We built 1,000, and then a few weeks after we had built all those beds, none of which were used, we sort of shuttered that whole plan and realized that we had the hospital capacity to deal with many of the admissions. So, and then another thing I want you at least to think about is Dr. Nigel Goldenfield. He is a University of Chicago epidemiologist, and he was working with the governor in terms of creating some of his policies. And this is what he said on April 25th of 2019 at a press conference. He said, modeling an epidemic is rather like modeling the trajectory of a rocket when you don't know where it started from, what direction it was pointing, and how much fuel is aboard the rocket. Modeling an epidemic is not rocket science, it's harder. And so what I'm trying to convey, especially as we're trying to take this science and apply it to policy, is just the large breadth of uncertainty that we face and how much we don't know about COVID-19, despite all of the actions and all of the laws and all of the executive orders that we have already put in place. And just to sort of underscore that point, even today, months after we've been affected by COVID, COVID is a daily part of just our conscious thought. We still don't know how many people COVID actually kills who are infected. In fact, we don't really have any reliable estimates. I mean, we have studies and there are people that have estimates, but there's no consensus in that regard. All right, so this is sort of where we started in March 24th. And this was the perspective, this was kind of the paradigm that the governor was coming from, where he was going to value, where he was going to value lives over money, or lives over our economy. And I'm just going to let him speak for himself. So on March 24th, 2020, he says this. He says, finally, there has been some talk over the last 24 hours by some about who this nation might be willing to sacrifice to COVID-19 for the sake of our economic interests. Well, in case there's any doubt in your minds, I'm not willing to sacrifice anyone. There is no life in this state that is more or less precious than any other. No person more or less worthy of saving. I want grandparents around to help raise their grandchildren. I want people to spend years after this is over celebrating birthdays and wedding anniversaries and healthy retirements. I want Illinois to continue to be enriched by its young and old residents alike. Our economic strength comes from our diversity in this state and the hard-won experience of our citizens. Without that, we are nothing. With it, there is nothing we cannot overcome. And I think that's very well said by the governor, and I think that represents his position very well. Let's talk about the adverse position. So the adverse position is that while it's true that coronavirus causes death, suffering, and human misery, so too does economic recession, and so too do stay-at-home orders. So human isolation and loneliness, especially when we're talking about vulnerable populations, such as the poor, the people who have substance abuse issues, the elderly, we are relational and we are a social species. And so stay-at-home orders have consequences on people. But so too does economic damage. Excuse me, but so too does an economic downturn that also has consequences that go well beyond bottom lines or pocketbooks. So while the governor tries to frame this as lives versus economic interests or lives versus money, the truth is it's lives versus lives. And the effects on the lives of Illinois residents that have been caused by this shutdown will be long-term and continue well beyond this pandemic. Consider the fact that estimates are that between 20 and 50 million people have lost their jobs, all right? Consider too that while the data is still premature, there have been immediate consequences in terms of increased mortality of healthy or uninfected people. Suicides in the United States since March, since many states have issued these lockdown stay-at-home orders, have drastically increased along with drug overdose deaths, all right? So and for many age demographics under the age of 55, the increases in the number of suicides and accidental drug overdose deaths exceed the rates of COVID deaths within that age group. Let me say that again. Let me say it a different way. The increase in the number of people who have died in certain age demographics under the age of 55. So just those increased numbers over the past few months exceed those of the number of deaths from COVID within those age groups, all right? And this all says nothing about how many years people will lose as a result of the health effects of stress and trauma from the shutdown. And you also have to remember that we live in a global economy, all right? And downturns in first world countries can often spell disasters in third world countries. So while in the United States, which is a first world country, if somebody's struggling because they lose their job, that could mean unemployment benefits. That could mean food stamps for struggling families. In third world countries, downturns in the global economy, as the United Nations put it, causes skyrocketing hunger and child mortality. All right. So the governor began issuing executive orders in early March. And you've all heard this term executive orders. So let's talk about what it means and by what authority the governor is actually doing this. So the statutory authority, because generally speaking, a governor is not a legislature. You can't pass laws telling people what to do, how to do it, when to do it, things of that nature. Rather, the power to legislate, as the name would seem to portend, belongs to the legislature. The governor is responsible for executing the laws, hence the executive. But the Illinois Emergency Management Act has conferred upon the governor certain powers in a time of quote unquote disaster. All right. So under the Illinois Emergency Management Act, disaster, and there's a lot of words there and I'm just going to skip, but what falls within the definition of disaster is epidemic or a public health emergency. And I think as we saw from the graph in terms of the increased number of deaths that we've seen in Illinois, this would certainly constitute a disaster. So when a governor declares a disaster, he then has certain powers, all right? So let's just take a look at this slide real quick. In the event of a disaster, the governor may, by proclamation, declare that a disaster exists, and the disaster declaration cannot exceed 30 days, and he may exercise those powers that are given to him under the Illinois Emergency Management for a period of time, again, not to exceed 30 days. Okay, so the first thing to note is what benchmarks or metrics does the governor have to meet before declaring a disaster? All right, does like a certain amount of land have to be destroyed? Do a certain number of people must exist? Does he have to show that a certain number of people have been infected by COVID-19? And the answer to that is none of the above. And this is one of the problematic aspects of the statute. There's nothing the governor has to establish prior to declaring a disaster. Whether or not to issue a disaster proclamation is entirely within his discretion. He can do it at any time as he deems appropriate. The second thing to notice is look at the incredible powers that he's then afforded after declaring a disaster. So look at the second bullet point, all right? he can control the movement of persons within the disaster area. Let's take a step back and think about that. The disaster area in this case is the entire state of Illinois. All right. So if the disaster area is in Illinois, the governor now has the power to control your day-to-day movement, which could logically include putting you, let's say, in an internment camp if you have contracted COVID. And then in addition to that, he can control the occupancy of premises therein. So he can determine who essentially is going to live in your house. All right. And then look at this catch-all phrase at the very bottom, the final bullet point. Again, there's a lot of words there. Let's just skip to the highlighted and italicized portion. So this is like a catch-all phrase. In addition to that, the governor, after declaring a disaster, can perform and exercise any other functions, powers, and duties as may be necessary to promote and secure the safety and the protection of citizens. All right. So what it basically seems to say is he can almost do whatever he thinks it takes to mitigate or take on the disaster. So what if he thought it was necessary to promote the public safety and the protection of people by suspending 3 elections this November? So, and I'm not saying, so now don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Governor Pritzker is doing any of this. I'm not saying that he's abusing his authority. I'm not saying that he intends to do any of this. What I'm trying to point out is that when you declare a disaster, you are imparting upon the governor a breathtaking scope of power that while this governor may not be abusing, the loss is still going to exist after Governor Pritzker is here. And the potential for abuse, I think, is extreme. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. All right, so let's go through our March timeline. So on March 9th, Governor declares the entire state of Illinois to be a disaster. And at the time, there were 11 cases of COVID-19. So this just goes back to what we were sort of talking about, which is when the governor declared a disaster, there were only 11 cases of COVID-19, all of which were in Chicago. Can anybody foresee in the next, I don't know, months, maybe even years, where there's not going to be 11 cases of COVID-19 in the state of Illinois? And if that's all that is required in order to justify a disaster declaration, the governor is going to have these incredible powers for the foreseeable future. All right. March 13th, 2020, the governor issues Executive Order 10, which cancels all private gatherings in the state of more than 1,000 people. So essentially concerts, festivals, sporting events, those are all done. On March 13th, he also closed down schools with Executive Order number 3. On March 13th, he issued Executive Order number 5, which closed down businesses, except that they could serve off premises and you can go to the store to pick up. And then on March 20th of 2020, the governor issues EO8, the stay-at-home order. And he issued this without any legislative oversight. So our elected officials who we sent down to Springfield in order to legislate did not get an opportunity to weigh in on Executive Order number 8, which essentially dictated and had severe day-to-day consequences in the lives of the 13 million people that live in the state of Illinois. Let's talk about EO8. That's the stay-at-home order. So the first thing is that all businesses except for essential businesses were shut down. And there's a couple things that I want to point out. Okay, so first of all is stores that sell groceries and medicines. They were allowed to stay open. So if I'm a mom and pop electronics store and all I sell is electronics, I have to be closed. All right. Or if I'm a mom and pop toy store in downtown Crystal Lake, I only sell little tchotchkes and toys for kids, I have to close down. Target, all right, and Walmart, they all get to stay open by virtue of the fact that they sell groceries. But in addition to continuing to be able to sell groceries, they were also allowed to remain open to sell electronics and toys and garden equipment and act like a nursery. So that was one of the things that a lot of people said, well, Governor, you're sort of picking economic winners or losers here in terms of your Executive Order number 8, which you unilaterally issued. In addition to that, so you have liquor stores and cannabis dispensaries. Those are considered to be essential by that word. And I don't know. I don't know that that's necessarily true. And that certainly was the subject of a lot of criticism that Governor Pritzker took, and especially with regard to the cannabis production and trying to maybe give a boost to a burgeoning industry that the governor ran on, and that was just getting off the ground this year. And then you guys all know there's the rest of these essential businesses, and you can refer back, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But I don't want to dwell on every single one of these businesses. You could also not leave your home except for essential activities, which included for health and safety, such as seeking emergency services or medicine or going to the hospital to get the necessary supplies that you need, which would include groceries, other medical supplies, things of that nature, for outdoor activity, for certain work at essential businesses. So you could leave your home to go to essential businesses, as well as to provide care for your family. And there's Mayor Lightfoot. And this was in April while this executive order was still in place. And that's her hairdresser. So executive orders for thee, but not for me, because the hairdresser left her house to go to Mayor Lightfoot's, not for an essential activity. Now let's talk about things that are not essential activities. And let's talk about sort of where those things, what place or what station do those things have in the lives of people? So going to church, all right? I'm Catholic. I consider going to church, my spiritual life, having communion not only with the rest of the parish, but also with God, to be an essential and incredibly important part of my life, all right? But I wasn't allowed to do that, but I could go to the cannabis store to get cannabis. Going to visit with my elderly parents was off limits. I couldn't leave my house to go and visit with my elderly parents unless I was going there to provide them with some type of care or service. A peaceful protest. So my First Amendment right to petition the government in the form of a peaceful protest and gathering with like-minded people, I could no longer do that. I couldn't go to a friend's house for poker. I couldn't go to a wedding. I couldn't go to a birthday party or a graduation party. And these are sort of the most essential things that make life worth living. And yet these are not considered to be essential, again, by a governor who unilaterally is making these decisions on behalf of 14 million people. Social distancing requirements, also as part of EO8, must maintain at least a 6-foot social distancing from other individuals. As part of the executive order, we were directed to wash our hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds as frequently as possible using hand sanitizer. We were directed to cover our coughs or sneezes, regularly cleaning high-touch surfaces, and not shaking hands. And here's Governor Pritzker at a March for Justice. And at this time, there was an executive order in place that said that gatherings of 50 or more people were off limits. So again, executive orders for thee, but not for me. April timeline. So April 1st of 2020, the governor issues EO16. Now, this is coming up on the 30-day deadline. Remember, the governor had issued the initial emergency disaster in early March. And now he's issuing another executive order extending all prior executive orders through April 30th, which means that these executive orders, he's acting pursuant to powers that are now going to go beyond 30 days, which raises the question as to whether or not that's legal. And of course, right on cue, on April 23rd of 2020, Representative Bailey sues Governor Pritzker. I don't know if you've ever heard of Senator Bailey, excuse me, I believe it's Senator Bailey, not Representative Bailey. But Senator Bailey is a state senator from Clay County, which is a county in way down southern Illinois. On April 23rd, the governor issues Executive Order 30, which bars any residential and non-residential evictions, which makes a lot of sense, especially in view of the fact that a lot of people can't make rent because they've lost their jobs and are no longer able to work. On April 30th, 2020, the governor issues Executive Order 32, which is very similar to the original stay-at-home order, Executive Order number 8, although it sort of thaws some of the restrictions, it loosens some of the restrictions. So in particular, outdoor recreation. State parks are open and boating in groups of 2, and you can go and use your boat. It was boating season was beginning to creep up on people, and I guess the boaters have a lobby, so they got to the governor and said, we want to start boating. But again, it's limited to 2 people. And so you have to start thinking about some of the contradictions. So there's a family of 6, and we want to drive to Fox Lake in our house, and the 6 of us are living in the same house. We get in the same car, we drive to the marina, but only 2 of us can get on the boat, and somehow that's going to limit the spread of COVID. And so again, we run up against this idea that when there's just one person who's issuing these orders and making these decisions, a deliberative group process that may go into this that may alleviate some of these contradictions and problematic aspects of these executive orders is not giving the opportunity to have certain benefits and to make some of these laws make sense. Essential businesses now include greenhouses and nurseries and gardening centers and golf courses, which was good. Non-essential retail. So the non-essential retail, let's say the Kohl's or the mom and pop toy store, not only could you order online, but then you could also go to the store and pick it up outside of the store. You still could not go in the store. And on April 30th, this was the first time that we saw Illinois mandate the face mask. So while in a public place, and if you cannot maintain a 6-foot social distance, now you have to wear a face mask. On April 29th of 2020, this affected me as the state's attorney. The Supreme Court suspended the speedy trial requirement, which meant that people who could not make bail, we no longer had to bring them to trial within 120 days. And the reason for that was because it would have been very difficult to accommodate 12 jurors in a juror box and maintain 6-foot social distancing. And that's still a problem today, but we, through various means, we're able to, and through using sort of the bigger courtroom, we're actually able to do that. But think about the guy who is in jail, who can't make bond, who now is no longer entitled to have his case heard before a jury within 120 days. Rather, he just has to sit and wait for the Illinois government to get around to it. April 30th, 2020, the beloved church sues Governor Pritzker, and they sued under their First Amendment right to the free exercise of religion. What they essentially argued was that, look, all of these other essential businesses are open, and yet you're not allowing us to practice our religion in our parish and in the way that we deem most appropriate. And so you're violating the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. So they filed on April 30th, and on May 9th, Elim Romanian Pentecostal Church and Logos Ministries of Nile got in on the act. On May 11th of 2020, Poopy's Bar, I didn't come up with the name, Poopy's Bar and Grill said that the order was unlawful and that the governor had exceeded his statutory authority in issuing executive orders past the 30-day disaster declaration period. On May 12th of 2020, Senator Cabello filed suit against Pritzker, and he's a senator from Rockford. I filed an amicus brief in support of Senator Cabello's suit for reasons that we're going to talk about. And then on May 8th, issue an emergency rule that made it a Class A misdemeanor for businesses to open. Oh, let me go back. So for those of you that don't know, a Class A misdemeanor is punishable by 365 days in jail. And in addition to that, it's punishable by up to a $2,500 fine. So for those restaurants that were struggling, that weren't able to meet their bottom lines because of the shutdown, if they decide to act in defiance of the executive order, the owners could potentially be placed in jail for up to 365 days, and they could face a steep fine. On May 29th, 2020, as a result of the uproar that the initial rule caused, so a little over 10 days later, IDPH repealed the rule. Now, what's interesting, and this is what I was talking about when I said we have to continue to, that this presentation really needs to be updated almost on a daily basis. IDPH has reissued this rule and it is passed. So now this actually is the law in Illinois. If a business opens in defiance or is not complying with the mask requirement, is not complying with the social distancing requirements, is not complying with the occupancy limits, they can be charged with a Class A misdemeanor. And on May 28th, 2020, as a result of a lot of the criticism that he received over people not being able to practice their religion as their conscience dictates, Governor Pritzker backed off of the banning of religious services, and instead of banning them and making it mandatory that you couldn't go, they issued recommendations on how church services should be, on how these church services should be done. And the recommendation and what they were trying to do is steer towards more remote services or outdoor services, or not having a church be occupied by more than 10 people. So they try, and they also wanted us to avoid some risky behavior like singing, because that apparently spreads some of the water molecules that carries the COVID virus further. Okay, so on May 29th, again, we begin to see some sunshine and some thawing in some of these executive orders. So we're going into phase 3, and all of this phase 3, the phase 4, and the phase 5, those are all set forth in executive orders. So in phase 3, which we as McHenry County, and we're part of a region that includes us and Lake County. So our region on May 29th was put in phase 3. And as part of phase 3, the stay-at-home order, so executive order, which started as executive order number 8, and then was rehashed as executive order number 16. That was no more, and so that was lifted. People could emerge from their homes for things other than essential activities, provided that we maintain social distancing as well as the face mask requirement. And there was still this 10-person limit. And the 10-person limit, however, did not apply to essential businesses, to retail stores with 50% capacity. And then again, of course, churches were encouraged to follow those IDPH guidelines that had previously been issued. What still remained closed in phase 3 were restaurants and bars, places of amusement, as well as gyms. And so how do we get to phase 4? Well, there has to be a under 20% positivity rate. And what that ultimately means is that no more than 20% of the people that were being tested could actually test positive for COVID. And they didn't want to see any wild swings in terms of that positivity rate. So it couldn't increase more than 10 percentage points over a 14-day period, which would indicate that we're in the midst of a spike. And then you also had to demonstrate that the hospital had capacity to accommodate any type of surges. And we passed that with flying colors. And so currently we are now in phase 4, us in Lake County. And what this means is that what phase 4 did is it did away with the limit on 10 persons gatherings. Now we can gather in groups of 50 people or more, again, provided the social distancing as well as the face masks. All manufacturing is open. All non-essential businesses are open, provided they comply with the guidelines. Bars and restaurants are open with occupancy limits as well as those guidelines that they need to comply with. Gyms and health clubs, those are all open. Entertainment's all open. Retail's all open, but it's restricted. And phase 5 is essentially coming out of COVID. And according to the governor in the executive order that he passed, that's only going to happen after we get a vaccine. Okay, so germane to people like me and many other people at the county level, as well as throughout the state, which is, okay, we have these executive orders that the governor has issued under the Illinois Emergency Agency Act, pursuant to the fact that he had declared a disaster. Great, fine. We understand all of the contents, but now the question is, who exactly is going to enforce these orders? Whose responsibility is it to enforce these orders? And if you look, this is just some of the I'm not going to bore you with reading all of this legalese, but this is some of the language from the Illinois Emergency Agency Act, and I'll just paraphrase it for you. It doesn't say anywhere that the state's attorney, the police, the local Department of Health, the Illinois Department of Health, the local emergency management groups, that any of those are supposed to enforce these orders. And it also doesn't spell out like what the penalty would be if somebody violated these orders. But if you watch the governor's press conferences, all he ever said was that enforcement should be on a local and not a state level. So, so this confused a lot of people, and people began this process of trying to figure out what exactly is enforcement supposed to look like. And what we would get back from the state was varying answers, but the governor seemed to prioritize sort of this educational enforcement. So if somebody, let's say back in March, was out and about and not engaging in an essential activity, it was up to the police or the local Department of Health to go and educate that person about the executive orders and see if they would voluntarily comply with the law. Well, the reason that I have a job is because people do not always voluntarily comply with the law, and it still begged the question of what to do when people are not complying with these executive orders after they've been educated and after they have full awareness of what the strictures and the mandates that the governor is asking of them. So I'm going to skip this slide. So this is the answer that police got from the Illinois State Police, and let's talk about it and see if we see any problems. So what they initially said is that they wanted the police to use their sort of community caretaking authority. Now, not all of the duties, responsibilities, and actions of police relate to detecting crime or investigating crime or acquiring evidence. Rather, we call on the police to do a lot of things that don't necessarily relate to crime. So, for example, if I gave a call to my mother who's elderly and who lives with my father alone, and I didn't get a call back for 4 days, it may be just because they don't like their son. That's certainly a possibility, but let's say that it's 10 days.
Patrick, just excuse me. We have 5 minutes. 5 more minutes.
We got 5 minutes. All right, I'm gonna hurry up then.
All good. All good.
All right. So let's say that they weren't getting. So let's say they weren't calling back. I could have the police go over there and ask them to go and do sort of a welfare check. Or if I break down on the side of the road, a police officer may put his lights on behind me and just to mark where I am in terms of being on the side of the road and protect me from oncoming traffic. That's sort of the community caretaking function. So when they saw people that are out and about, they wanted the police to go and sort of educate them. And if they didn't do it, then they wanted us to charge them with reckless conduct. And a person commits reckless conduct when, by any means, lawful or unlawfully, they perform an act that endangers the safety of another person. But my question was, well, let's say we see somebody out on the street, or I see somebody in Walmart that doesn't have a face mask on. I can't prove that they're endangering another person unless I prove that they actually have COVID, and there's no way that I can force them to get a test, and I'm not entitled to their medical records. So how exactly am I supposed to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt? That's a difficulty. In terms of enforcing this, the main resistance that the governor was getting was from restaurants and bars that were shut down, especially after a lot of the retail stores opened. I think at the very beginning of this, many of the businesses and many people in Illinois were giving the governor the benefit of the doubt. A lot of people recognized this to be a significant threat and wanted to do their part and voluntarily complied with the executive orders. But as time went on, a lot of the restaurants didn't necessarily see a light at the end of the tunnel, and they began to open. So how did the state ultimately enforce the executive orders? They sent them a letter saying that if you continue to remain open, we're going to pull your liquor license. All right. So let's go quickly, very quickly now, into the statutory argument. All right. And this is Senator Bailey. And he said, and so the question is, how many bites at the apple does the governor get in terms of issuing these disaster proclamations? So so can the governor in perpetuity continue to issue disaster declaration upon disaster declaration for the next 10 years? All right. And that's what Senator Bailey said. And he said, essentially, look, the governor gets one bite at the apple here, and then and that makes sense because we need an executive to respond to these emergency situations. We need one guy at the helm when everything goes to hell who can react. And the legislature is not the body to do that because they got to haggle and they got to talk to each other and they have to count votes and they have a more deliberative process. So you give the governor 30 days to react, but then you have the legislature who has those 30 days to come up and pass the legislation that we need to deal with the disaster, in this case, COVID-19. And that's what Senator Bailey essentially was arguing. And he won in one court, and the same argument that was made in 4 other courts, they found for the governor that because the statute did not explicitly say that the governor could not issue subsequent disaster declarations, that means that he can, which in terms of statutory interpretation may not be the best. But as of right now, there's a Clay County judge that has indicated that every single executive order that the governor's issued is null and void. And for people like me trying to figure out what all that means, especially when 4 other courts have said that no, they're actually valid and binding, is kind of difficult, and we're in uncharted water. And then really quickly, let's talk about the constitutional argument. So do these executive orders abridge your free speech by virtue of the fact that you can't go out and protest, by virtue of the fact that it limits your ability to engage in political speech, and does it also abridge your and does it also abridge the free exercise of religion? And everybody who's at the first day of constitutional law class, they told you that every single right that people have is not absolute, right? Just like you can't yell fire in a movie theater. The idea is when we have a pandemic, necessarily constitutional rights have to be constricted for a period of time. But what people were arguing is that, hey, look, you're discriminating against religions because nowhere in the Constitution does it say that I have the right to smoke cannabis or go drink liquor or go to work or go to my manufacturing job. But it does say that I have the right to practice my religion. So on the one hand, you're saying these are all essential, and you're valuing these over the rights that are guaranteed to us under the Constitution. That's discriminating against religion. And if you're going to allow people to go to work, you're going to allow people to go to certain places to shop, you should also be allowing people their right to practice the necessary freedoms that have been given to us by the Constitution. You can't value other things if we're going to be boiling things down in an executive order to what's essential and what's not essential. They were saying, let's start with our constitutional rights as essential and then go from there. And so that's a lot of what the churches were saying. And there's a strict scrutiny test that I'm not going to be able to get into, but I'll tell you what the Supreme Court says. And then I'm going to wrap up and open it up for questions. The United States Supreme Court, in addressing a very similar executive order that Governor Newsom passed in California, they said, and I'm just going to read it to you. Although California's guidelines places restrictions on places of worship, those restrictions appear consistent with the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. Similar or more severe restrictions apply to comparable secular gatherings, including lectures, concerts, movie showings, spectator sports, and theatrical performances, where large groups of people gather in close proximity for extended period of time. And the order exempts or treats more leniently only dissimilar activities such as operating grocery stores, banks, and laundromats, in which people neither congregate in large groups nor remain in close proximity for extended periods of time. So essentially what the Supreme Court is saying is that if you want to establish a constitutional violation, what you need to do is show that a government regulation is discriminating against religion or against freedom of speech or against a certain speech-based perspective, okay, or the content of that speech. And they're saying that, no, that's not what the government is doing, because look, they've also banned similar types of gatherings such as concerts, movie theaters, other things where COVID could pass, and that the real reason for these restrictions is not because we're discriminating against religion, but because we're trying to limit the spread of COVID. And whether or not that's a good argument, I don't know, because if you're going to say that, look, we just don't want people gathering in a place for a long period of time, well, then why are we allowing people to go to certain offices, things of that nature? So I still think that this is in abeyance, and I think there's going to be a lot more law to come with respect to the constitutional issues that we're all sort of struggling with right now. So with that, thank you for your time and attention. And do you have any questions?
So far, I'm looking in the Q&A. I think you covered everything, so many of the facts so well. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. Does anyone have any discussion on all of what has been happening?
I know it's a lot to throw at everybody, so you're...
yeah, by all means.
I think they're tired like the rest of us.
It is.
Yeah,
very,
right. It's like that's,
time,
you know,
the timeline.
that's how I felt in law school, you know.
Well, they do have your number, so if they have any concerns,
so you have my number as well as my well, you have my number, and if anything occurs to anybody going forward, please feel free to give me a call at the state's attorney's office or to email me. You can just go on the state's attorney website for the email address, and I'd be more than happy to discuss this with you further and engage with you.
we just had one question pop up, Barb.
Yeah, I see that. Would it be permissible to hold an outdoor church picnic?
So the answer is Probably yes, but you have to remember, so going back, so we're right now in phase 4, which bans gatherings of more than 50 people. But generally that's been interpreted to be within a particular building or within like a habitation. Outdoor activity is fine. You just need to continue to comply with the executive order of social distancing as well as face masks.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Patrick. We have one more speaker, and he's going to end the night, and it's called Medicare Benefits During COVID-19. Looks like COVID's ending the day. Ugh. I wish it would just
as
end.
it does every other day, right? Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your time, Wisconsin, and your family.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks for your time.
Bye.